This recording was made July 13th, 1960. This is Terry Miller speaking, and I'm recording this thing for the whole family to listen to. Speaking of dates, I know a very important thing that happened on this day. Oh, not too many years ago. I think it was in 1956 on this date. And you do know about this, don't you? About the famous scientific discovery. You don't know about it? Oh, well, it was a marvelous thing that they did. It was done by this Englishman, Don Surley. Yes, he was an Englishman, but he moved to Mexico 5 years ago today. And he was working on a brand new experimental candle that would light underwater. It wouldn't light above water, just underwater. And it was a terribly big undertaking, and it took him 3 years to make the formula for this candle, and another 2 years to perfect the first candle of this type. But finally he made it, and on this day in 1956 he got his best friend, Jose, to get into a diving suit and go down underwater and light the candle with a special match to see if it would light. And that's how it got the name, sort of, to try to see if it would light. So they called it a tri-light. They were real ingenious. And so he got Jose into the diving suit, and Jose jumped overboard from this boat that they were on. And word got around real quickly in this little Mexican village, and most of the population of the village came out to see exactly what was going on. And word was passed from one to the other by mouth of this great experiment. And they were all real tense about the whole thing. But they waited on the shore, and Don Surley waited on the boat. And when the tri-light was supposed to light underwater, then you'd know it would light, because the water would turn a special kind of blue, sort of a bluish, purplish greenish, and the whole water would become that way for a whole big distance around. But that still wasn't proof that it was lit, because the water could do that anyway, because the water was mostly blue to begin with. And the only way they would really know is that when Jose came up, for about 3 or 4 seconds after the candle was raised out of the water, it would still be lit. But after 3 or 4 seconds, it would smother in the atmosphere and go out. But this was the only way that they knew that the candle would actually work. So Jose was down there, and then all of a sudden, the ocean turned a sort of bluish, purplish, greenish. But it could have done this anyway, so they didn't know that that was the experiment. The candle actually working underwater. But they were all very tense. And finally, Jose came up, and he waved the candle back and forth, and it was lit. It was just lit for a little time, but they all knew that it worked. And Don Surley was overjoyed, and the crowd was on the shore, and they were cheering, "Jose, can you see by the Don Surley's light, when so proudly we hail at the tri-light's last gleaming?" No applause, just throw money. Money, huh? Well, that reminds me of another story I heard once. This is a real sad tale. There was this guy who was newlywed, and he was taking this job so he could get money to support his wife. But he wasn't so sure that his wife was really so intelligent, you know. She would always do things that didn't seem quite right. But his boss didn't know this, and he didn't either, not quite yet. Well, the day after the marriage, the boss called him in. This was 3 or 4 days after he had gotten his job. And he was very nervous because he hadn't really talked with the boss too much yet. And he was afraid he was going to be fired. So he went into the boss shivering, and the boss said, "Sit down, I want to talk to you." So he sat down, but he was still pretty nervous. And the boss went on with the story of how his married life has been so terrible, and he's hated it so much because he hasn't been the master in his house. And he just wanted to give some good old advice. And he went on about how you should be the master in your house and don't let the little wife boss you around or anything. You've got to be the supreme, you know. And he took this in pretty well. And that night he went home for the first meal. And his wife was waiting at the door, smiling one of her foolish smiles. And she said she had the meal all ready, and all he had to do was to sit down in the dining room. So he walked into the dining room, and he sat down, and she came in with trays and trays of food. There was sirloin steak, there were peas, and coffee. Very nice meal. Well, the sirloin steak was like a rock, the peas were like pebbles, and the coffee was like used dishwater. Well, he took one bite of the steak, one spoonful of peas, and one sip of the coffee, and he felt sick to his stomach. He was all ready to take her into his arms and console her and make her feel fine again, when all of a sudden he remembered what his boss said. So he jumped up in a usual married man's manner, and he started to scream and shout about how terrible the food was. Well, she just stood there with one of her sad little faces, and she didn't say a word. He went on and on and on about how he was fed this stuff after working in the office all day and how he couldn't stand it, he wasn't going to eat here anymore, on and on and on. So, finally he says, well, what do you have to say for yourself? She looked up with those big blue eyes, and she said, nothing. It was a real sad story there. Well, he just got so furious at her for not saying anything back so he could keep going, that he couldn't think of anything to do besides lifting up his plate, walking over to the window, and throwing it out the window, which is what he did. Well, his wife saw this, and suddenly she acted like she got a big idea, a brainstorm. She picked up the main platter, her dish, her silverware, everything on the table, including the tablecloth, picked it up in one big bundle, walked over to the window, and dropped it out. She looked at him with his big baby blue eyes, and she said, honey, if you wanted to eat on the patio, you should have told me. All of which leads me to another sad story, of which I will now relate the context. It seems in a small town of Cucamonga, Tennessee, there was a very famous tree surgeon, and his specialty was elm trees. Next to the church, in the middle of Cucamonga, Tennessee, there was a huge holly tree, and it was the pride and joy of everyone in the little town. Well, one day, the church officials called up this famous tree surgeon, and they told him that there was some dreaded disease on the upper branches of the holly tree, and that he should rush down to the holly tree immediately. So he hopped into his little tree surgeon ambulance and raced down to the scene of the crime. When he got there, he took out his ladder and he climbed up to the top of the holly tree, which was quite a good ways up. When he got up there, he turned to his right and he saw there was one limb that was completely covered with what do you call it, pink fungus stuff. I forget the name of it offhand. It was very sickening looking. But he took out his pocket saw and he chopped off the limb. Then he turned around to his, behind him sort of, and there was another limb right there. And the end branches were just starting to get the pink fungus. So he took out his saw and he chopped that one down too. Well, just then, out of the church, come Mr. and Mrs. Hall from Newlyweds. And they sit down under the tree that he's up on top of, and they start to make plans for their honeymoon. They're having a very good time, when all of a sudden this huge branch of holly tree comes down and hits both of them square on the head. And this tree surgeon became the first man ever to deck the halls with boughs of holly.